Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. By now, you're all becoming very familiar with the rhythm of this conference, in which case you'll realise that it's time for our next video. In the last year or so, we've had several volunteers come and help us in the Archive Centre. And one of them, Patrick Ivan, I think is coming along later tonight to the reception and dinner. He's currently entering his third year at Anglo-Irish University, and here is his reflection on his time with us.
Hello, I'm Patrick Ivan, and I am a second-year history undergraduate at Anglo-Irish University, and I have recently completed a volunteer placement here at Churchill Archive Centre. As a volunteer, my main project was to box list the Nicol papers. They were donated to the archives in 1994 by the family of Davidson Nicol. He was a Sierra Leonean ambassador to the UK, as well as to many Nordic countries, and he worked for UNITAR for many years, and then went on to be the Secretary General of the United Nations Associations Federation. Probably one of my favourite things that I've worked with here is the UN Security Council meeting minutes from during the Gulf War, when the Security Council were discussing roads to peace and ways to end the conflict. And I thought that's such an important piece of world history, and I was holding it, so I thought that was quite cool.
Okay. Right. Well, on to the next panel. The Archive Centre is extremely lucky to have a particular special relationship of its own with the friends of the late John Antcliffe. Some of whom are with us this afternoon. And they've created a fund to help us with research into the Thatcher era. And we now have a panel of some of the former recipients of the generosity of the friends of John Antcliffe. These are our John Antcliffe Byfellows. To tell us more is Lord Boateng, known to all of you, I think, as a former cabinet minister in the Blair government and as a High Commissioner to South Africa, but known to us here in this college as the chairman of our Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust, about which you were hearing earlier, and a member of our Archives Committee. Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. Isn't it just great to be here? This is a celebration, and thank you to Alan and his colleagues for making it possible. It's a party. It lasts a couple of days, which actually brings us back to memories of the 60s, which some of us can remember. Actually, quite a few of us in this audience can remember by the look of it. But it's a party with a purpose, because we're here because we all believe, everyone here believes, that history matters and that archives matter. And that archives gives us an insight, not just into individuals, but also into periods of time, into political ages, into political circumstances. And it's entirely fitting that the John Antcliffe Byfellows and the made possible by the family and friends of John Antcliffe, it's entirely fitting that at this time we should be looking at that period characterized as the Thatcher era between 1975 and 1997, when so much changed for so many and for much of this country. And indeed, we still live, do we not, with the legacy of that change, whether for good or for ill. And John Antcliffe was very much a part of that. A merchant banker, a friend of Margaret Thatcher, someone who, a true believer, also a dedicated and committed local councillor who also stood in Greenwich in a by-election, which I remember. And there are a number of you in this room, one old colleague of mine, well, I won't refuse to say the word old, that's a forbidden term, but a former colleague of mine who remembers that Thatcher period very well, because it's then that we cut our teeth in opposition. And what was significant about that time, and it's worth remembering those times, is that it was a time of ideas, wasn't it? It was a time in which there was a conflict of ideas. Ideas mattered, ideology mattered, and that gave public discourse a richness and a depth that, to a certain extent, it lacks today. That, I think, is the reality. But we live with part and parcel of that legacy at a time in which we're all thinking about the collapse of one major infrastructure project, or the apparent collapse of one major infrastructure project in high-speed rail 2. It was during that era, and during Margaret Thatcher's period in office, that we did see the delivery of high-speed 1 and the Channel Tunnel, which was the last great infrastructure project that this country was a party to. So a time of ideas, ideology, but also of pragmatism, as we are going to learn from the first contributor to our panel, our distinguished panel today. Dr. Tom Hurst, who is the author of one of Margaret Thatcher's most important advisors, the role of John Hoskyns. Tom, who did his PhD at King's and went on to be an archival fellow here, thanks to the generosity of the family and friends of John Ancliffe, is going to talk to us about that particular start of that period and the life and role of John Hoskyns. Over to you.
Thanks very much. So what I'm going to do is briefly reflect my time here at Cambridge, and then really explore some of the research and some of the conclusions that came out of that research whilst I was here. So I arrived at the Archive Centre in the summer of 2018, quite a long time ago now, and the Bayer Fellowship provided me with quite a rare opportunity. So during the week, I'm actually a deputy head teacher at a state school in North London. In fact, I'd probably be just finishing detentions as we speak now, so it's a nice break to be here with you. So being able to come and spend what was essentially my summer holidays in the archive was quite a rare opportunity, and I wanted to thank Alan, who was very flexible with the dates to allow me to do that. I should also really thank Andrew Riley, who is at the back, who really pointed me towards the papers of John Hoskyns, the under-researched papers of John Hoskyns, and led me to spend a wonderful 2 months reading pretty much every document in the 2 volumes that make up those papers. Since then, I got a little bit distracted. I've just finished off a book, which should be with the publishers soon, looking at Margaret Thatcher and her speech making. So it's been a real pleasure to come back and review some of the conclusions and some of the work I did in 2018. I think it's particularly important because it highlights the way, and this kind of links quite nicely to the last panel we had, the way that detailed archival research of one particular person can really throw up some big questions about the general narrative in which that person is placed. And so it's kind of with that in mind that I'm going to talk you through some of the conclusions I reached looking at John Hoskyns. So it makes sense to start by asking, who was John Hoskyns? And I think to answer that question, we need to go back to the spring of 1975, when John Hoskyns had sold his computer systems company, Hoskyns Group, and used the profits to support his own personal research into the causes of the British disease. In July of the same year, Hoskyns, as part of that research, met Lord Plowden. So for those that don't know, he had headed up the Central Economic Planning staff from 47 to 53. And after a few moments of apparently awkward silence, Plowden leaned forward and asked Hoskyns, "Who are you?" Which is probably quite disconcerting. And Hoskyns remembers it was clear that I was one of the few people he had ever spoken to who was not in Who's Who. I think that's quite interesting that Hoskyns begins his memoirs with that anecdote. Firstly, I think Hoskyns uses that anecdote to underline his role as an outsider, detached from both the establishment and the political establishment. And secondly, I suspect Hoskyns uses that anecdote in an ironic way, because by the time he published his memoirs in 2000, Hoskyns had been credited with being an important figure in the establishment of Thatcherism. He had been head of Thatcher's policy unit from 1979 to 1982, and he's been described by at least one commentator as being Thatcher's most important advisor. However, I would like to use this paper as an opportunity to really revisit Plowden's question, who was John Hoskyns? And an analysis of the Hoskyns papers really raises some quite big questions. Firstly, I would question the degree to which Hoskyns really was an outsider. I would also question the extent to which Hoskyns really did influence Conservative Party policy and, in so doing, raise questions over the triumphal account of Thatcherism in which Hoskyns is thought to have played a part. So I would suggest that Hoskyns was not the establishment outsider that he claimed to be. He was a Wykehamist, he was a former member of the Rifle Brigade, and he was a member of the Travellers Club. This doesn't really conform to a narrative of an establishment outsider. Nevertheless, it is true that he was not a member of the Westminster bubble, at least not initially. He was able to bring a skill set to the Conservative Party's approach to policy formation that had its roots in his career outside of politics. For example, he used causal diagrams, a technique that he had learnt at IBM, to enable the creation of stepping stones, which in turn led to the hardening of the Conservative Party's discussion of trade union reform pre-1979. He was also credited with shaping the 1980 Civil Service Pay Review, and he takes a lot of credit himself in his memoirs for shaping the 1981 budget. But the papers would suggest that these were rare episodes of influence. In the same year that Hoskyns claimed that his influence had borne fruit in shaping the 1981 budget, that's a phrase from his memoirs, in his papers there is a resignation letter that was never delivered, where he stated that he felt frustrated at his inability to make any significant political impact. And I think this lack of influence is best demonstrated maybe in three areas. One, in stepping stones. So stepping stones is held up as, you know, the master plan for the Conservative assault on trade union reform. But within the first year of Hoskyns being in government, he had already accepted that stepping stones was dead, and he was looking for an outlet to relaunch the programme. Jim Pryor, Hoskyns lobbied very hard for Thatcher not to give employment to Jim Pryor. So Pryor previously had been a big opponent of stepping stones and Hoskyns. But Thatcher did give employment, the Secretary of State of Employment to Pryor in 1979. And also British Leyland in 1980. British Leyland requested financial support from the government. Hoskyns was desperate for this not to happen. He wrote, "Our best opportunity for starting the closure of British Leyland is now," underlined. Thatcher was actually privately sympathetic to this position, but on the 22nd of January 1981, Thatcher decided to back British Leyland. Therefore, it's not surprising that by the early 1980s, Hoskyns was complaining that his advice had not been listened to. So this raises a question. Why did Hoskyns lack influence in shaping the Conservative Party policy's agenda 1979 to 82? I think the first area is manner and how he related to Thatcher. Hoskyns cast himself, Thatcher didn't ask him to, he cast himself in the role of Thatcher's candid friend, which is quite a dangerous position to be, I'd imagine. At times, Thatcher appreciated Hoskyns' ability of keeping the government's eye on the ball, but it seemed that Hoskyns was unable to moderate his candid advice. Take, for example, the note to Thatcher entitled "Your Political Survival." I know. Takes a brave man. Which Hoskyns passed to Thatcher in August 1981. Bear in mind, the previous month had seen Thatcher face riots in London, Leeds, Birmingham and Liverpool, a deepening rift in the cabinet, and the strengthening of the SDP. Despite this, Hoskyns felt that it was a perfect time to tell Thatcher, you lack management competence. You break every rule of good man management. Unsurprisingly, the letter went down very badly. In Hoskyns' words, he said, I suspect that it, the letter, marked the point at which she, Thatcher, decided she'd had enough of me. So in the words of Hoskyns' school motto, manners maketh the man, and in Hoskyns' case, I think by the early 1980s, his manners and his kind of candid nature with Thatcher had contributed to his decline in his influence. But I think there's one more area we should look at, which kind of links to what we were talking about at the start of this panel, and that's to think about Hoskyns and Thatcher's relation to ideology, a Thatcherite ideology. So Hoskyns has been described as one of Thatcher's people. He's seen as playing an important role in establishing Thatcherism in opposition and in the early years of the 1980s. Thatcher herself credits this in her memoirs, especially in The Path to Power, the volume that deals with her position in opposition. And Hoskyns, unsurprisingly, does not disagree. In fact, in dramatic style, he ends his memoirs by asserting that he personally had successfully secured the beachheads of Thatcherism. But there is no doubt that Hoskyns advocated what could be described as the Thatcherite policy agenda in opposition and in government. But the archives tell a slightly different story. The problem for Hoskyns was that Thatcher, the politician that she was, often rejected Hoskyns' ideologically loaded advice in favour of a more pragmatic approach. Nowhere is this better evidenced than in the construction of Thatcher's 1981 party conference speech. Now, just to put it into perspective, during the conference, Ted Heath had publicly attacked Thatcher's economic policy. And this outraged Hoskyns. And he wrote to Thatcher and he said, we may really have to destroy him, Heath, in the conference speech. And obviously by doing so, push forward a Thatcherite agenda that the policy unit advocated. And on hearing, so he wrote, Ronnie Miller, who was a speechwriter, and Hoskyns, and a little bit of Sherman wrote a speech that was very, very, very Thatcherite and really went after Heath. But on hearing the proposed speech, Clive Whitmore, Principal Private Secretary to the PM, 79 to 82, advised caution. He drew attention to the reaction that such a speech might provoke, not only from the wet wing of the Conservatives, but from the general public more generally. Remember that in March 1981, 364 economists had written to the Times criticising Thatcher's economic policies. And interestingly, realising the political dangers of Hoskyns' proposed script, Thatcher rejected it outright and favoured an alternative script written by John Gummer, widely seen as, in Hoskyns' words, a leading wet. And Hoskyns basically went into meltdown. He was absolutely outraged by this. And from that moment, he began seriously considering resignation. So I think this episode is telling. It shows that Hoskyns' limited influence over Thatcher was the result not just of quite an abrasive manner, but also of his prioritisation of ideological principles over pragmatism. So what do the Hoskyns papers tell us about Hoskyns and Thatcherism? I think, firstly, instead of viewing Hoskyns as some kind of ideological paratrooper, establishing beachheads from which Thatcherite assault upon the Conservative Party and the political establishment more generally would be launched, it's perhaps better to view him as a political advisor who really struggled during the early 1980s to gain traction with his advice. And this inability to exert influence is interesting because it raises questions over the triumphal account of Thatcherism. far from leading a small band of Thatcherites in some kind of peasants' revolt, Thatcher in fact favoured, or regularly favoured, pragmatic approaches to ideological approaches. And it's for this reason that by the end of 1981, Hoskyns had been sidelined. Instead of working on policy development, as he felt he should be, he was reduced to, in his words, fixing Thatcher's diary problems. In early 1982, therefore, Hoskyns resigned. He had finally realised that he was simply too Thatcherite for Thatcher.
Thank you very much indeed for that. We've got time for a question to each of our panellists in turn. So who's going to ask the question? Any takers? Any takers? If not, the question I have for you is, how do you square the position and the approach you've described in relation to Margaret Thatcher and her pragmatism with U-turn if you want, this lady's not for turning? How did she get that? And her characterization of Pryor and others as being not one of us. So how did she get that balance? She clearly had that balance, but she was no Liz Truss. And Liz Truss is no Margaret Thatcher. So how did that come about?
So that's a good question. I think that Thatcher certainly had her key principles. She knew what she wanted to achieve. I think the difference between Thatcher and Hoskyns was Hoskyns saw any kind of backward step, any kind of flex as some kind of defeat, yeah. Whereas I think Thatcher was willing to flex in order to achieve her long-term goals. And on the term of one of us, if you look at Thatcher's speech writing, you know, lots of her speeches are written by people who are definitely not one of them. Yeah. So, you know, you have lots and lots of people who are, you know, suspected by the whips of leaking things against Thatcher, you know, of really undermining her, but they're very good at speech writing, so they do the job. So I think Thatcher knows who's good at doing particular jobs, wants the job done, and she'll bring them in to do it.
A very considerable talent in politics, undoubtedly. Yes, we've got time for you, sir.
Would you agree that part of Thatcher's statecraft, effectively, was to have a lot of advisors, but she didn't necessarily take much notice of their advice? So in contrast to the kind of Cummings-Johnson relationship, where the advisor is in the driving seat and the politician is being manipulated. But Thatcher was never in that position, I don't think, was she?
So I think Thatcher consulted lots and lots of people, but very much on her terms. I think you're right. And one thing that really upsets John Hoskyns is that he is likened to a dental technician, because again, he's brought in to do one job, and the problem is he literally writes his own job description. So there's a tussle and there's a fight. Who will lead the policy unit in 1979? And he wins, and he gets that position. He writes his own. You know, he's desperate for strategy. You know, he's coming from the city. He writes his own job description and gives it to Thatcher. That's not top of Thatcher's to-do list as she sweeps into government in 1979, and it just doesn't really get read. So I think the problem is Hoskyns thinks he's there to do one job, and Thatcher uses him to do another, one particular job, and that's what leads to problems. So I think you're right. I think Thatcher will go to people when she needs advice, but then step back if she doesn't need it.
Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to go on to hear from Stephen, Dr. Stephen Kelly, who's going to talk about Margaret Thatcher, Anglo-Irish relations, and Northern Ireland. He is a lecturer in modern history at Liverpool Hope University, and indeed did his PhD in the School of History and Archive at UCID. So we're looking forward very much to your presentation. And you're going to do it from over there, Stephen. Great. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming along today, and I just want to say a few thank yous before I start. I'd like to say thanks to Alan and Andrew in particular and the team here for inviting me along to this terrific event. I also would like to say a special thanks to the John Ancliffe group who are sitting in front of me today. It's wonderful to see you again after a number of years. Now, as the title of my paper suggests, I want to look at two themes about my research around Margaret Thatcher, and that's the research that I conducted to produce the monograph on the top right-hand corner, a shameless piece of self-publicity, which is available on Amazon if you wish to go on today and buy it, but also then talk about the outputs. And I'll finish on the outputs because it brings me back to why this institution and archival institutions more broadly are so important for historians. So, first of all, just to give you a bit of context, I was awarded the Archives by Fellowship in January, February of 2017, which seems like a long, long time ago. And when I arrived this morning, I took a little walk around the campus, and I was struck how little it's changed, but also in many ways how my life has changed since that time that I was here. Since 2017, I've got married to my wife Jenny, and I've welcomed my little daughter Hannah into the world. So although the campus hasn't changed a lot, my life has, and it's wonderful to be able to come back here now and kind of celebrate my achievements, both from an academic perspective and also from a private perspective. Now, let me just ask you today to think about, not necessarily about the end product of my research, but actually the process of gathering and correlating archival documentation. Because it is a very tiresome, sometimes cumbersome, and sometimes a very frustrating job as a historian. And I know in the previous talks, I think it was Alex talked about collaborative efforts between historians and archives. But also I want to highlight today some of the barriers to research that I've witnessed, not here, but at other archival institutions. And I'd be happy to share my views and hear other people's views on that very topic about what I would call gatekeeping and the withholding of archival material, which is something I've faced on numerous occasions during the course of my research. But at this institution, I never had that problem. The archivists have been absolutely brilliant in offering the encouragement and the advice, given their skill set around the archives that I could gather during my time here. And it goes without saying, of course, that the key research for my time at Cambridge was looking at Margaret Thatcher's papers. An absolute wealth of material covering Thatcher's private life and indeed her public life as a politician, from her period as leader of opposition from 1975 to 79 to her 3 periods as UK Prime Minister throughout the course of the 1980s. But also, of course, there are other really important papers, contemporaries of Thatcher, that are kept here, and I just draw your attention to a few of them that I was able to access during my time at Cambridge. For me, apart from the Thatcher papers, Sir David Goodall's unpublished manuscript was particularly important. Now, since 2017, David Goodall's manuscript has been published. Now, for those who aren't familiar with David Goodall, he was a very important figure in Anglo-Irish relations during the course of the mid-1980s. He worked at the senior level within the Cabinet Office, and he played an integral role in helping to deliver the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which was signed on behalf of the British and Irish government in 1985. So his manuscript, his memoir, gives a very vivid account of the technicalities around the diplomacy at that time and the frustrations that Thatcher had, not just with the Irish governments, and I'm thinking here particularly Charles Haughey, the Irish Taoiseach or Prime Minister, who she did not get on with, but also with Gareth Fitzgerald, who was Taoiseach after Charlie Haughey, and indeed civil servants within the Irish government. But what's striking about Goodall's manuscript as well, and it comes back to the point that was asked around Thatcher's relationship with civil servants, is how much she was cajoled into signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985 by her civil servants. And I'm talking here chiefly around Sir Robert Armstrong and David Goodall. Thatcher didn't want to sign the Anglo-Irish Agreement. There's many reasons why she did sign it, but one of the main reasons is the role of her civil servants. So I would actually suggest that civil servants play a really important role, and although we might suggest that Thatcher was an ideologue, she was open to considerations and expressions of guidance from those who were very close in her inner circle. Also, I suppose another important set of papers would be, of course, Pell's papers. For those who aren't aware, apart from being a parliamentarian and a member of Heath's cabinet, he also went on to become an Ulster Unionist MP for South Down during the late 1970s and 1980s. And his insight, his vehement opposition to Thatcher's Northern Ireland policy throughout the course of the 1980s is striking. His letters, his correspondence with Thatcher, really, for me, made me understand the complexities of the Conservative Party's Northern Ireland policy and how many within the party itself were opposed to Thatcher's stance in Northern Ireland, which I'll come to a little later on. Then we shouldn't forget, and I don't know if it's been mentioned today, and forgive me if I'm repeating what's already been said, but there is an absolutely amazing, amazing resource, and it's the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. And it was founded, of course, and is run by Chris Collins. This source is the #1 source to go to if you can't get access via the physical environment here at Cambridge. Go online. It's the source that I tell all my students to use. It is absolutely brilliant, and I take my hat off to Chris Collins for the hard work he's achieved in digitalising Margaret Thatcher's private and public papers. And it's a long process, and I know it's ongoing, but it's been really, really helpful in terms of my research over the last number of years. Now, let me then turn to another institution that's proved to be very important to my research, but also an area that's proved to be problematic in terms of my research, and that's the National Archives of the United Kingdom. Now, why would I say that? Well, first of all, the National Archives has been, again, a really important source for me in terms of gathering primary source material, particularly the Prime Minister's office during Thatcher's period in office, and also the Cabinet Office, the Northern Ireland Office, specifically relating to the Northern Ireland Office, which operated after Stormont was shut down in 1972, and the Rec Rue was introduced, and of course the Security Service files. Now, my issue, and it's not a criticism per se of the National Archives, this is more a broader policy, is the idea that archival files are being restricted to academics. Now, there's many reasons why they should be restricted, and I want to be very clear about that. There's sensitivity around security-related matters, so not all files can be made available to the public. For example, files relating to the 1981 Republican hunger strikes. Some of them files will remain closed until 2075. Some of them will remain closed indefinitely. There's other files related to the horrendous murders of corporals Holmes and Howe in 1988 by the Provisional IRA. You might remember the images of those two soldiers who were pulled from their car and executed. Those files should be made available because of sensitivity around information, personal information. However, there are many other files that I've tried on several occasions through Freedom of Information requests to get access to, and I've been shot down. One example was in 2019, I issued a Freedom of Information request to get access to a file relating to Margaret Thatcher and meetings that she was having with the then Prime Minister of Ireland, the Taoiseach Charles Haughey. Now, after several weeks, I got an email back from the National Archives to tell me that after consultation between the National Archives and the Cabinet Office, I was not allowed, or would not be these files would not be made public. Now, the reason why I was given for not allowing these files to be made public was because of the current delicate interactions between the British and Irish governments in the context of the Brexit negotiations. Now, I didn't understand, and I still don't understand, why at that moment in time the files relating to 1989 would be restricted in the context of negotiations in 2017, 2018. And that's happened to me several times. But I persist and I persist, and you know, it is a frustration, as you can probably see, in terms of what I'm trying to articulate today. But there has been some success stories. So let me just go on to the next one. Apart from my time here at Cambridge, I jumped on the bus, and I was talking about this earlier on. Unbeknown to me, when I decided to take the bus from Cambridge to Oxford, I didn't realise how long it was going to take me. And also, I decided stupidly that in a day I would conduct the research at the Bodleian Library and then jump back on the bus and come back here. So all in all, it must have been a 16, 17-hour trip, but it proved amazingly productive, because having spent time there and previously online correlating the file numbers, I came across some amazing material that hadn't been used before, related to the Northern Ireland Subcommittee, the Northern Ireland Committee. This is a parliamentary committee that was set up, and it ran during the 1970s into the 1980s. But it was really important because when Thatcher came to power in 1975, this committee was advising her on Northern Ireland policy. And it was led by John Biggs Davison, whom I'm sure you've heard of, and many others within the Conservative Party at the time. And of course, Erin Neve as well, who we'll come to in a moment. But what's striking about the minutes of these meetings is it demonstrated that Thatcher was listening to these parliamentarians, and they were advising her on constructing a policy vis-a-vis the Conservative Party at the time. Now, what's also striking is in 1979, when Thatcher comes to power, she completely dismantles any association with this body. and then starts to listen to the civil service, which isn't unusual, but it just demonstrates how party policy will considerably be shifted when a party becomes a government. And that's a prime example that my findings demonstrating in my research. Another part of this freedom of information request, which was, again, a positive outcome, was my ability, following persistent freedom of information requests, to get papers opened that belonged to the late Éire Niamh. So in 2016, in response to a freedom of information request to the Parliamentary Archive, so Éire Niamh's papers are kept in Westminster, the Parliamentary Archive. 52 previously closed files on Éire Niamh's papers were open to researchers. And again, an absolute treasure trove of information. Material that had never been looked at before. Now, just to put this into context, Éire Niamh was assassinated by the Irish National Liberation, so-called army, in March 1979 as he left Westminster. He would have been Thatcher's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. He was a really, really important figure in Thatcher's shadow cabinet, but unfortunately he never got to fulfil his political ambitions. But the papers reveal a man who not only was dedicated to finding a security solution to the problems in Northern Ireland, but also, and this is which really challenges the current historiography, was interested in a political settlement. Yes, he wanted to defeat the Provisional IRA, but he also wanted to find a workable political solution. And again, thankfully, because I got access to these papers, I was able to open up this new kind of chapter of our understanding of the Conservative Party and its kind of policies towards Northern Ireland. And then, having used these archives, of course, the role of a historian is also, if you can, if you're a contemporary historian, try to access interviews. And a lot of the time, I found politicians, retired politicians and civil servants are very open and accommodating to academics. And you know, one example would be the late Lord Robert Armstrong, who over a phone interview, which lasted for probably 2 hours, provided me with some, you know, really, well, fruitful and, you know, important kind of reflections on Thatcher and her Northern Ireland policy. And not only that, but apart from Sir Robert Armstrong, I was able to interview several other personalities from both the Irish context and the British context over the course of my research. And I've just given you a few here just as a demonstration. The point I'm trying to make is that the role of a historian is to try harvest the archives and the primary sources from wherever you can. If it be public archives, private archives, institutions of this nature, and through oral histories as well, and particularly the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. That brings me to, just to finish up with 2 more slides, Margaret Thatcher's autobiography. We listened this morning about Winston Churchill's autobiography, and you know, in some ways, his interpretation of those events. All autobiographies are inherently biased. That's just the nature of them, and they project a particular perspective, and that's fine. As academics, we have to be careful of that and digest the information. But what's striking from Margaret Thatcher's autobiography is her honesty, from the Northern Ireland context at least. And from my research of the archives, it's complemented what she said. So rather than tearing apart her memoir, I've actually found it really useful. One kind of footnote to this would be, during the height of the Republican hunger strikes in 1981, when Bobby Sands passed away after 66 days in hunger strike, the correspondence between Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet colleagues and the Irish government around this issue was, you know, to the fore for decision-making and policy-making at the time. But also in her memoir, which I thought was quite striking, she talked of Bobby Sands' courage. Even though she vehemently opposed anything that Bobby Sands stood for, she was able to at least admire the fact that he was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for his cause. Again, she was completely opposed to anything that, any ideas of republicanism. But it just shows you the level, intellectual ability that Margaret Thatcher had. She wasn't a pure ideologue that people have suggested. I think she was pragmatic on occasions. And that comes out, I hope, in my research. So just to bring my kind of talk to a conclusion, I come back to where I started. I come from a small non-red brick institution, Liverpool Hopi Institution. And there's a great onus on me as an academic to produce, you know, decent, high-quality publications, particularly in the context of the REF. Now, there's many people here who know all about the REF, Research Excellent Environment, or Research Excellent Framework, okay? I won't go on about it today, but I have an obligation to produce high-quality work, if that's how it's rated, because my institution will receive monies based on the quality of my outputs. And I'll finish on this. Without the support of institutions like this, without the intellectual support and the physical support, the environment for me to research, spend 2 months here, I could never have got those outputs. And that's why I'm indebted to this institution and the archival staff for all the support they've given me over the last number of years. So thank you. Go raibh míle maith agat.
Thank you, Stephen, very, very much. Dr. Kelly, thank you very much indeed for that. Any question? Yes.
Thank you. Stephen, lovely to see you again, and it's been a pleasure to support the work of the, I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of all the donors here this afternoon. It's really been a pleasure to support your work and that of your academic colleagues. I don't know if this is a slightly unfair question, but what do you think Mrs. Thatcher would have thought of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework?
That is an unfair question, but I'll give it a go. What was your thought? What I can say, and to put this in the wider context, she did support the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, so she was fully fledged committed to the peace process. What she was upset about, of course, was the release of political prisoners, particularly Patrick McGee, who was the lead terrorist who tried to assassinate Thatcher at Brighton in 1984. And she wrote a letter to Mo Mowlam, giving out stink to the very fact that he was released. So based on that premise, I think she would have been supportive of the framework document, which is a better outcome than what we had before, but it still hasn't really solved the fundamental problems about the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And as someone whose family live in Northern Ireland, I dread the thought of having to see the reinstatement of physical borders and checkpoints, because that for me will be the beginning of the end of the peace process, and it will herald the revival of parliamentarism across the island of Ireland. So hopefully we don't see that.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Dr. Piers.
Most interesting talk. I'm particularly interested by what you said about Bobby Sands. Margaret Thatcher said to me in the late 1990s, she asked me whether I could, this in the context of complaining bitterly about the holiday camp conditions that terrorists were being held under in Northern Ireland. She asked me whether I could name any of the other hunger strikers who died. And I guess this was a question that she asked everybody. I'd like to know whether that is the case, because of course I failed at the first hurdle. I couldn't name any others at all. And it seemed to me that far from taking the attitude that you suggest she took, she was actually quite vengeful about these hunger strikers as using blackmail against the British government.
Yes, I would argue that the vast majority of people couldn't name the 9 additional hunger strikers who died during that period. So you're correct in that particular point. And yes, she absolutely despised republicanism. She despised the activities of the hunger strikers. That was the point I was trying to make, is she admired their courage, which is different to being sympathetic towards them. And to the credit to Margaret Thatcher, and this is something that's been forgotten about, although the UK government will always deny that they will speak to terrorists, Thatcher's government did speak to terrorists during that process, and it was Thatcher who initiated Peter Brook, who went on to be successor of Northern Ireland Secretary under John Major, to negotiations with the provisional movement. I'm talking here about Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. Thatcher authorised those discussions, so she was a pragmatist and someone who cared deeply about the deaths of British soldiers. That was one thing that struck me. I think it's Charles Moore made this point in his memoir. Thatcher had a habit that no Prime Minister had done before since, of writing a handwritten letter to every family of a British soldier who was murdered at the hands of Republican terrorists, which I think again is quite striking about Thatcher, and you know, her sense that she really felt for those young men who were losing their lives tragically.
While you're on that, she did undoubtedly feel. She also felt for Erin Eve, and someone you haven't mentioned, who I think should be mentioned, Ian Gow, who was a very special person. I didn't know Erin Eve, I did know Ian Gow quite well. So tell us about the influence of the death and the circumstances of the death of those two men on her approach to Northern Ireland.
So the death of Erin Eve was transformative regarding Thatcher's attitude to Northern Ireland, because the moment she heard of the news of Eve's death, she broke down into tears. She was personally devastated by this loss of a confidant. It was Erin Eve who had led her campaign against Ted Heath in 1975. So she had Eve in many ways to thank for her success. And it was Eve actually who asked for the portfolio as Secretary of State or Shadow Secretary of State, like the graveyard of ministerial portfolio. But he wanted that because he had this background in security and he wanted to see a solution. So to answer your question, that left an indelible imprint that she wanted to find a security solution to the conflict, and it was something that she was kind of very much to the forefront of her political thinking in the 1970s. In the early 1980s. That starts to shift then by the mid-1980s. So after the Brighton bombing, she sanctions negotiations with the Irish government about finding what would become the Anglo-Irish agreement which allowed the Irish government to have a consultative role in the affairs of Northern Ireland. And then towards the end of her career, of course, Gow was assassinated in 1990. So her opening of her career as a Prime Minister is at the death of Erin Eve, and the closing of her political career is the death of her very close confidant in 1990. So they did have a profound impact on her. And as I said, there was a personal and an emotional side to Thatcher's stance in Northern Ireland because of the personal experiences that she suffered, not just personally with the assassination attempt, but to those very close to her.
Thank you. If we can now move on to Sir Richard Clarke and a very important work by Dr. Thomas Kelsey, An Economic Liberation from Within, the work of Sir Richard Clarke. And Tom is currently an ESRC Policy and Research Fellow at the Blavatnik School and is someone who has worked very closely on and is working very closely on how you improve policy making at the intersection of economic prosperity and national security. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to make two core arguments in this paper. The first is that looking at the career of Sir Richard Clarke, who was the second permanent secretary in the Treasury, would become PermSec of the Ministry of Aviation and then the Ministry of Technology, underlines an argument I've made elsewhere, and that's that we can see political change in post-war Britain, I would argue, as much a story of an economic liberalism from within as much as a neoliberalism from without. I'll explain what I mean by that exactly in a moment. I also want to contribute to a broader discussion about the future of British political history, saying that perhaps we should be more relaxed about the need for methodological innovation and more interested in the need for historiographical innovation. So we already know that our existing histories of the British state play out against a partial vision of its politics. The centrality of the warfare state and the autarkic drive behind it has now been made clear. So much so that the rise and fall of economic nationalism has been suggested as a new way of framing the post-war period, rather than a narrative of a social democracy betrayed by neoliberalism, for instance. So with the importance of the national economy understood, we can begin to ask questions about it. Who were its critics? How did the transition from nationalism to liberalism occur? Now, one of the core arguments of my PhD was to say that when you look at policy for high technology, so supersonic aviation and nuclear power in particular, you can see that the Treasury, in fact, never reconciled themselves to the nationalistic desire for Britain to be a science and tech superpower. They criticised these great techno-nationalist projects from the beginning and actually helped to bring about effectively a masked cancellation of these long-running state investments in the 1970s. And in fact, what I think this shows is that there was a liberal critique from within the state that had transformed the political economy of Britain before Thatcher even became leader of the Conservative Party. But looking again at Clarke's work, in particular during the 1960s, I think underlines this argument that it was the Treasury, not CND or E.P. Thompson, who were the most important critics of the military-industrial complex in post-war Britain, and indeed that they were a consistent voice of liberalism too. Now, there is a little bit of a sense of this within the existing literature. George Peden remarked on the post-war Treasury's preference for open markets and noted their opposition to rearmament in the early 1950s. Both Jim Tomlinson and David Edgerton have explained Treasury officials, in fact, prefigured Harold Wilson's white heat critique, agreeing that too much state-funded R&D was going on to prestige projects and defence. I think what I want to say builds on these insights very much, but goes a little further. I think what I want to say is that if we are to understand the decline of economic nationalism in post-war Britain, particularly in terms of high technology, we should see this as largely a battle within the state in which party politics was secondary. And I think, as I said, looking at Clarke in the 1960s really helps to make this argument. There's no doubt that running down the warfare state was a key priority for Richard Clarke when he was in the Treasury in the early 1960s. So what I've put up on the screen here is a note that Clarke wrote for the incoming Chancellor on issues of public expenditure in 1960. Within this tremendously important field, the problem of Britain's oversized military-industrial complex was central. As you can see, the end of the first paragraph puts the point clearly. Industrial growth and exports are inevitably thwarted when the keenest spirits in industry and the best research scientists and technologists are employed on publicly financed projects which may contribute to the national defence and prestige, but yield no worthwhile economic return. Government oversees military and political expenditure is a formidable and growing direct charge on the balance of payments and a continuous threat, apparent or concealed, to the stability of sterling. This wasn't just a one-off shot at the military-industrial complex. So again, in 1965, a joint paper between the Treasury and the Department of Economic Affairs, I think written by Richard Clarke, argued that the economic problems of the country will not be solved unless there's a steady reduction in defence spending. You might wonder whether this was really a liberal critique. Is this not just Treasury penny pinching? I would argue this really is about liberalism, and that's because if you begin to look at the arguments that Clarke makes, they have very standard sort of liberal characteristics. So Clarke doubted at a fundamental level whether the state could actually pick winners to spearhead the future of industrial progress. When writing to Alec Cairncross in 1963, then a government economic advisor, Clarke explained, quote, I normally start from a position of some scepticism whether government expenditure on civil science is or not advantageous for the national economy, probably at best a distortion of resources and at worst diversion of scientists from good economic commercial work to non-economic prestige work. There was an internationalism within this critique as well, that essentially the UK could rely on its allies abroad for key technologies. So Clarke argued that it was fine to scrap Blue Streak, the space launcher program, because the UK could rely on the USA in this area. There was also a sense that the market, or at least the customer, should direct state-funded R&D rather than ministers, or even worse, in Clarke's view, state engineers. The Atomic Energy Authority was a particular target for Clarke's attacks. Now, it must be remembered that the Atomic Energy Authority, which designed both Britain's nuclear reactors and its atomic weapons, was at the heart of its national technological effort in the post-war period. And actually, it absorbed about a third of all civil R&D in the early 1960s. This was a level that Clarke described as, quote, utterly preposterous. As early as 1961, Clarke urged that the Central Electricity Generating Board, that was the nationalised electricity supplier, should direct the Atomic Energy Authority's reactor development programme, creating a situation where basically the customer or the user of the research would be controlling its direction. One of the core ideas in the historical literature on industrial strategy in post-war Britain is that Harold Wilson's white heat was an important turning point. The argument is not, however, that Wilson injected technocracy into the British state, but that Wilson redirected it. That he sought to shift away from prestige projects and defence towards smaller, more modest state-led programmes that appeared commercially viable. But I think thinking about Clarke's time as permanent secretary within the Ministry of Technology suggests that actually this was more of a longer story of state disillusion with techno-nationalism, and actually highlights how Labour did more to reset than British techno-nationalism than to criticise it, at least at first. And it's actually the politics of atomic energy that I think are really key in making this point. So as I've already explained, by the early 1960s, Clarke was deeply sceptical of the Atomic Energy Authority and British-designed nuclear reactors. Labour, in contrast, were not. They actually backed a much larger second nuclear power programme than the Conservatives had outlined, which actually turned out to be one of the worst, or one economist at least called it one of the worst decisions ever taken in public investment. Part of the politics here was that many on the left saw the Atomic Energy Authority as a sort of form of high socialism, a sort of remarkable display of what the state could do. But as it became evident that the AGR, the British-designed nuclear reactor, was in fact a disaster, the despair that Clarke had in the early 1960s actually spread to Labour ministers as well. And so in 1969, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, when Minister of Technology, asked Clarke what they should do about civil research and development at a general level, given the obvious need to cut the size of the Atomic Energy Authority. And it's in this context that Clarke comes up with the idea of the British Research and Development Corporation. What he wanted to do was to bring all the scientists employed in the 5 civil research establishments and the Atomic Energy Authority into one organisation. This would be 1/3 funded by government, 1/3 funded by industry, and 1/3 funded by departments. And the idea here was to try and make sure that state-funded R&D was more directed and in tune with the needs of industry. And Clarke, in particular, wanted to cut to the Atomic Energy Authority from 31,000 employees to 10,000 employees within 5 years. That crucial fact, though, remained a state secret, but the broader reforms that Clarke called for were published in a Green Paper in 1970. And what I want to suggest is that this is a clear and, in fact, very public statement that for the state engineers, the party was over. And this came from a civil servant who'd been calling for their downfall for about a decade. So my aim in this paper has been to suggest that looking at the work of Sir Richard Clarke in the 1960s adds further evidence to this wider argument that I want to make about the demise of techno-nationalism in post-war Britain, that this was as much, if not indeed more, about an economic liberalism from within than a neoliberalism from without. But I also think that this poses sort of wider questions for British political history as well. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about how to keep British political history interesting. And one of the ways of doing that that's been proposed is we should focus on new methodologies. And I'm not a methodological Luddite, but I do think there is something simpler to say, and that's that we shouldn't assume that we have good answers to important basic questions. And I hope what my paper might urge us to do is to think about, well, what do we know about the operation of political power in post-war Britain, particularly the relative influence of different departments, of course, particularly the Treasury, and also the relations between officials and ministers too. Of course, there are works that talk about these topics, but we have to understand that some of them are stuck in an older declinist framework. So if you take Lord Hennessy's classic work, Whitehall, it focuses on generalist administrators and doesn't talk about the nationalistic or technocratic strands of the British state, for example. So I think with a new post-declinist map of the British state, we, I think, have the opportunity to think afresh about how it really operated. And it would feel remiss not to say that in any such endeavour, the as yet undiscovered treasures of the Churchill Archive Centre will, of course, be central. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Thomas. Questions? Yes.
Thank you for that, Tom. That was really super interesting. In my own research, I have encountered Treasury hostility to state investment more in terms of social policy and social planning, specifically around the Social Science Research Council and those other areas that I'm interested in. And there's a bit of a narrative, this is a sort of history question, there's a bit of a narrative that's emerged by people like the work of Matthew Grimley and Ben Jackson and myself, that certain areas of social policy inflected with kind of reform of social science end up kind of sort of thriving from the 50s to the 70s and then being sort of pushed back against really during the Thatcher period because these people are sort of seen as ideological and sentimental Council and not sharing the values of government. But I guess I'm wondering to what extent, because I have seen quite a lot of Treasury hostility to the kinds of social plans that the sociologists I'm interested in have been advancing. So, what extent this thesis about R&D can be extended to the social policy realm and reframe how we think about that as well?
I think Mike. Thank you for that brilliant question. I mean, my sort of short answer to that is I think you're far better qualified to figure that out than myself. But you've exactly, your question, exemplifies what I want to try to do really, and that's merely to say that
it's all the Treasury's fault.
No. Precisely. What was the role of the Treasury in the post-war period? When did it have power? What areas of policy did it have power in? We need to figure that out. There isn't a good guide in the literature.
Well, yeah. What do you say to the argument that the Treasury really has been hostile to industrial policy per se at all times, actually? That it's never had any time for industrial policy, that it saw George Brown's department as a rival that had to be slapped down, that it saw the DTI as a rival that had to be slapped down, and that has been a continuum through all governments at all times post-war.
So I would agree very strongly with that assessment that the Treasury has always been liberal, but you've got to remember that the standard declinist claim is that the Treasury has always been liberal and always been all-powerful, and thus Britain never had any proper industrial strategy. What I argue is that the Treasury was indeed liberal, but it was not all-powerful, and that was a bad thing. And it was partly because the Treasury wasn't listened to in the 1950s and 60s, you get these disastrous, over-ambitious investments that Britain would have been better off without.
And what was happening in France at the same time, under the Gaullist government, where they were investing in nuclear, they were investing in high-speed rail, they were investing in all those areas where they're now superior to ourselves and own vast trunks of our own infrastructure. What do you say to that?
What I would say is that when thinking about the British case, I think we could characterise it as a tragedy of strength. That really in the late 50s and early 60s, Britain was the scientific and technological powerhouse of Western Europe, quite different to France. So take something like the Concorde project, for example. Mm-hmm. The French actually got the capacity to develop jet engines through the Concorde project, and Britain was pretty much the world leader in jet engines in 1945. So if you are the third player in scientific and industrial terms, I would argue that your position is actually far harder than weaker nations, because you have plausible areas of strength, but you end up losing out to the United States. So actually, oddly enough, I think for weaker countries, it's easier to be more strategic. That would be my...
Thank you very much, and that's a great entree into our final panelist, Dr. Emma Barrett, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but fortunately is with us virtually. So welcome, Emma. I hope you can hear me. But you're on mute. It's always the way. Could you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Great. That's wonderful. And Emma teaches at the Birmingham Institute, Birmingham International Academy Foundation module Understanding Law, Critical Reflection. She is somebody who has written a very important piece of work, Survival, Capitalism, and the Big Bang, and is currently working on women's experience of working in finance from 1970 to 2008. So she brings all those strands of economy, law, and a real deep understanding of the use and purposes of archive. So over to you, Emma.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. And I'm very sorry to be joining you online due to COVID, so apologies for not being there in person today. I'd like to thank the Churchill Archive Centre for awarding me the Antcliffe By Fellowship when I completed my PhD in 2020. And I want to acknowledge that my work on the Thatcher government and the Big Bang is very close to John Antcliffe's own interests in new right politics and the City of London. Today I want to talk about the main outputs from my BI-fellowship, and I'm going to focus on my forthcoming book, Survival, Capitalism and the Big Bang. And rather like the other papers on this panel, it broadens out the use of the archive compared with the previous panel on individuals. The Big Bang, of course, refers to the deregulation of the London Stock Exchange on the 27th of October 1986 and the introduction of computerised trading. Reforms opened the city to outside competition and epitomised the spirit of the Thatcher era. And it's really hard to overstate their impact. They changed the nature and scale of financial transactions domestically and globally, the culture and landscape of the City of London, and the culture of everyday Britain through the process of financialisation. The Big Bang represented a shift in the British economy, and it helped to establish a new consensus that the market mechanism was common sense and progressive, and that alternative systems and approaches were flawed, a message that was ultimately absorbed by New Labour. When footloose capital caused the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, the system emerged relatively unscathed for want of alternatives, because of the socially and institutionally embedded nature of neoliberalism, and because of the network power of the banking system. Deregulation is associated quite rightly with ideological supply-side reforms, but I'm going to come back to this. And it's fair to say that in the literature, the Big Bang is usually understood as the inevitable outcome of new right ideas, global economic shifts, new technologies, and free-flowing capital. It was during my PhD that I developed the concept of survival capitalism, and it was this that I tested during my BI-fellowship by examining various private and economic papers with the enormous help of Andrew Riley. And this was really crucial because notions of crisis and declinism were at least in part politically constructed by the new right for political purposes. And I wanted to test whether existential concerns about the survival of capitalism, whether they really did exist within political and financial circles. So where did the concept of survival capitalism come from? Well, I interviewed Sir Adam Ridley in 2017, and he shared the angst in conservative political circles in the late 1970s. And here you can see they were dealing with what they thought were existential problems about the survival of capitalism. And when one remembers the stock exchange, we talked about what to do when there were no quoted companies left. I mean, that was the degree of threat. Now, Ridley will be well known to this audience, and his papers are, of course, housed in the Archive Centre. Thinking back to the 1970s, Britain was the sick man of Europe. There was high inflation, high unemployment. Trade union activism challenged government's abilities to govern, and business was threatened by this vicious cycle of low productivity, low investment, and low growth. Many believed that the state was overburdened and Britain was in terminal decline. And then following the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system, newly unleashed international capital was also a major concern. By the end of the 1970s, it was widely feared that international capital would soon bypass the London Stock Exchange. There was real anxiety at the Stock Exchange, member firms, and the Bank of England that the UK would lose its central market, described to me by the monetarist Gordon Pepper as the goose that lays the golden eggs. The bank was driven by the need to shore up the central market and keep regulatory control of it. And this emerges as the bank's most important consideration by far. I conceptualise survival capitalism as a term for the responses and strategies that were developed in reaction to seemingly existential threats, which ultimately led to the expansion of capitalism as it became an agent for change, driving popular capitalism. And this is, of course, in contrast to the Soviet alternative. Actors and institutions crafted their responses and strategies using their networks of influence to ensure ultimately that capitalism not only survived but thrived in a challenging period of global economic change. So the book is about the survival of capitalism and survivals of the cultures of capitalism. And it challenges the perception of the onward march of anonymous market forces, that this is somehow inevitable, and that reforms were simply the inevitable outcome of the undoubtedly vast increase in international capital in this period. Turning to the 3 C's in the book's subtitle and taking culture and contingency together, despite Big Bang referring to a single momentous event, revolutionary reforms were part of an evolutionary process. Neither the extent of the challenges nor the solutions were clear from the outset. They gradually emerged. And as they did, reforms were shaped by the culture, traditions, and interests of firms and state institutions. They were therefore the product of specific historical and geographical conditions. For instance, at interview in 2017, Gordon Pepper talked of the need to understand the nature of change and respond accordingly. The quote on this slide helps capture the existential threat from international capital and deregulation, as Salomons here was a large foreign bank. But what it really does is highlight how responses, in this case business restructuring, to perceived threats, how they played a key part in what was a dynamic reform process, and how global forces were mediated and shaped locally. Warburg and Barclays Bank and the stockbrokers Cazenove all had distinct culturally informed reform strategies, which I discuss in the book, as did historical institutions like the Bank of England. And this is why we need to take seriously the role of culture in shaping reforms. Ultimately, I argue that reforms were driven, but not imposed by government, with a great deal of help from the Bank of England, of course, but they were substantially shaped by practitioners in the process. If we think about contingency and capital together, one of my key claims is that the Thatcher government's preoccupation with statecraft reached right to the heart of financial markets. This is in the context of gilt-edged strikes in the 1970s and early 1980s, which impacted government funding, programme delivery and credibility. The real possibility this could topple a government was felt, of course, in the IMF crisis of 1976. Despite preparations, Adam Ridley described the Thatcher government's first experience of a gilt strike as like a blow below the solar plexus. Winded, from then on, they were looking at alternative ways of funding. A new auction system gradually emerged as the government's strongly preferred means of selling debt, but this could only be introduced by reforming the rules governing the London Stock Exchange. So there was a parallel set of macroeconomic drivers which drove what are generally regarded as supply-side reforms. Essentially, macro and micro objectives were working in parallel, and they gradually converged in the Big Bang. From the macroeconomic perspective, auctions designed to enable government to sell however much debt it wanted to sell, when it wanted to sell it. And from a statecraft perspective, this brought autonomy. The downside was that auctions were associated with financial volatility, but Nigel Lawson calculated that having more money in the financial system would mitigate increased financial risk. So survival capitalism argues that global capital and indeed new technologies should not be seen simply as independent drivers of reforms. Both were tools which the state harnessed for gain. Global capital and new technologies could and would have bypassed the London Stock Exchange, but for strategies taken. It was a closed shop after all. Throughout the book, I explored the threats and the gradually unfolding responses to them. And technology is really interesting because there was a heroic effort to capture and monopolise it within the stock exchange and thereby shore up the central market. In terms of structure and methods, survival capitalism encompasses the Thatcher government, the Bank of England, the London Stock Exchange and member firms, and Lloyd's of London. It adopts a cross-disciplinary cultural approach to financial and political history, and theoretical insights have sparked new lines of inquiry and analysis, but conclusions are drawn from empirically grounded archival research, the importance of which we've seen throughout today. The focus on culture sets it apart from other economic histories, which often attribute global shifts to, they attribute change to global shifts and to the inevitability of marketisation. A focus on intent sets it apart from other political histories, which sometimes overestimate the significance of ministerial agency and underplay the significance of the role of institutions and the accumulated weight of culture in affecting change. A more granular approach to the unfolding of events exposes intent, and I think intent, like culture, cuts across structure and agency and takes account of circumstances and ideas, policies, culturally constituted institutional preferences and objectives, hence the Treasury, and actions and reactions. And these new perspectives and historical explanations of how and why events unfolded as they did show that the Big Bang was a highly mediated, contingent and pragmatic process driven by multiple players and networks. The Thatcher government was not as coherent as has often been assumed, and while it was certainly ideological, ideology was tempered with pragmatism and nationalistic self-interest. So survival capitalism is demonstrating how the strong state sought to manage the free economy. I'd like to end on the relevance of a detailed historical assessment of Big Bang as the current Conservative administration, not this one, imagines a dash for growth with Big Bang 2, rebranded as the Edinburgh Reforms after the economic debacle of the Truss administration's ideology-driven policies. I would say that the current administration would do well to remember lessons in statecraft from its predecessors. Thatcher government deregulated, but not only in the pursuit of free market ideology. It was at least as motivated by economic nationalism, that is the need to deliver its monetary policy, maintain credibility and fund its reform programme at as low a cost as possible. Neither was the Thatcher government nor its successor laissez-faire. It sought to protect British interests, as the chapter on Lloyd's of London makes clear. It may have had limited success in terms of long-term British ownership of financial institutions. But remember, the key priority was to maintain a central market and therefore central control of that market. The government was not averse to intervening in markets when the need arose. So in short, pragmatism overrode ideology. The Thatcher government worked extremely closely with the Bank of England on strategy and could enable networked solutions to problems. And I think, again, we're seeing drift in this area today. The short-lived Truss administration undoubtedly applied the wrong lessons from British economic and political history of the 1980s. It ignored the importance of networks and culture and made no attempt to carry the market with it when seeking to effect change. I think the Edinburgh Reforms will only succeed and earn the title Big Bang 2 if they incorporate these lessons from the original Big Bang reforms of the 1980s. And I'd just like to finish with a very brief mention of my follow-up project on sex and the city, gender in the City of London. This explores women's experiences of working in the city. And I want to thank the John Ancliffe trustees for helping me secure numerous oral histories, testimonies for that project. So thank you very much.
Dr. Barrett, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think as we now have to bring this session to a close, I think having heard our panelists as you have, you just get a sense of the depth of the knowledge, the depth of the understanding that access to the archives have produced in terms of their work and scholarship, and therefore of the huge debt that we owe to John Ancliffe and his family for making that possible. So let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you.